Eventually, I was contacted by Ray Fiennes by the phone in mid-July 2019, and he'd seen my dialect tour of the UK on Charlie Haylock YouTube, showing all the different mouth and lip movements each of the dialects that I was doing, including Suffolk. And because it's more important to look at mouth movements when you're trying to do a dialect than listening. Ear will fine-tune it, but if you get the lip movements right, you're 80% sure of getting a dialect. And every dialect has different lip movements, as he saw on the YouTube, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then he saw me doing the difference between East and West Suffolk and the different lip movements, and he thought, he's the boy I want for teaching him to do a Suffolk dialect. And then they contacted me, agreed, and as soon as I agreed, 2 days later, I received the script, which I read, and then I suffocated. Now, that meant rewriting it. This was just the Suffolk lines, not the other ones. And I read it phonetically, and I slipped in a few Suffolk phrases and dialect words. There's no good putting things in like Sloightly on the her, because outside East Anglia, nobody would understand that. Bearing in mind, the film is being shown in America, Canada, worldwide,
mm-hmm.
right? Okay, then it's no good saying there's, when they walked across the field early summer morning, there's a heavy dag today, a heavy dew, because once again it wouldn't be understood.
Mm-hmm.
But where I could, I slipped in a few Suffolk dialect words. So when Mrs. Pretty is down in the dig, and it's a bit unstable, Basil Brown says, "You mustn't be down there, Mrs. Pretty." Well, I was able to slip in, "You mayn't be down there, Mrs. Pretty." And everybody will know what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
And then changing the grammar, so like we're now leaving rather than we're leaving now, and come you here, and do you take care of her. So I could slip in a Suffolk way of saying it, which made the accent more authentic for the film, but people would still understand it. Early August, I met Rafe at Colchester Station, and then I realised for the first time it was for real. Right, I actually saw the bloke.
Yeah.
And then we went from the Keith Theatre to Sudbury, and we had quite a number of training sessions there. Now, he was there for the whole day. He was there for an 8-hour session, and the next time another 8-hour session. So it wasn't just turning up for half an hour. And we went through the script. We then went out into the community because he decided that he wanted to be in a Suffolk dialect non-stop, offset, on-set, weekends away until the end of filming. He was going to stay in a Suffolk dialect non-stop. So we went out into Cass so he could order up his bacon sandwich. Have a bacon sandwich, please, dear. And so one lady recognised him, so he autographed the menu. We then went into some Suffolk pubs, in the tap room and the public bar, so we could join in with the locals in conversation. So not only could he get the sound right for the Suffolk dialect, but also the rhythm.
Mm.
And this is most important. It's no good sound in Suffolk if you haven't got the rhythm and if you haven't got those pauses. Because the big thing about the Suffolk dialect is, one, it's not too fast. And secondly, when we're talking, there are lots and lots of pauses. And that came through in the film because there's a line there which says, Mrs. Pretty has just said that she was also involved in an archaeological dig when she was a young girl, just old enough to hold a trowel. And then Basil Brown looks at her and says, according to the script, that speaks, doesn't it, the past? And I say to Rafe, right, we've got to put a pause in there. Must put a pause in there because a Suffolk person wouldn't say it like that. So it comes out, it speaks, doesn't it? The past. Now, whilst that gap and that pause, Mrs. Pretty is thinking, what speaks? Everybody watching the film thinks, what speaks?
Yeah.
And as soon as people have thought that, then you've brought people in. It goes back to our storytelling times from Beowulf to the present day.
Mm-hmm.
Those pauses means that you're bringing the audience in, you're bringing the listener in and the viewer into your storytelling and conversation, and they feel part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is essential when portraying a Suffolk dialect. This is pre-filming, so filming didn't start until mid-September. But early in September, I then ran 2 workshops, Suffolk dialect workshops, for all the other Suffolk actors. Did this in a London dance studio because I insisted on mirrors. When I was working with Rafe at the Key Theatre, we had mirrors, right? Because then he could copy my lip movements, look in the mirror and copy my lip movements. And by getting my lip movements right, he was getting the accent right.
Yeah.
So therefore, we had this here dance studio in London, and I ran two workshops. Rafe turned up to one of them, and there was Monica Dolan, who played Mrs. Maybrowen, Eddie Piercy, who played Mrs. Lyons, Bronwyn James, who played Mrs. Pretty's maid, Joe Hurst, who was John Jacobs, and James Dryden, who was Mr. Spooner. And I'd suffocated all their scripts and used the mirrors so they could get the copy the lip movements right. And at the end of each workshop, all the actors got their smartphones out and filmed me reciting all their lines.
Oh, wow.
So when they went home, right, not only could they hear me,
Yeah.
but also see my lip movements, so they could carry on practicing their lines and get the accent right. Now, some were struggling. So Joe Hurst, who played John Jacobs, right, he came all the way from South Wales to spend a day with me in Albury. They came down on the Saturday, stayed Saturday night with a mate of his. Then Sunday, I met them, and then we went to Snape Sunday Market, so we could then walk amongst Suffolk people, listen to the Suffolk dialect. I introduced him to people so he could get into the swing of it, just to get the dialect right. And all he had was one line in the whole of the film. But he wanted to get it right.
Yeah.
Because I told him right from the word start. My first words to Rafe, well, apart from hello, was, you know, I've got my work cut out, didn't you? And he looked at me, why? I said, because all you actors, when you try and do a Suffolk accent, you end up like West Country Pirates.
Yes.
So he said, right. So that was the first. And I told all the actors that I do not want to hear West Country. I don't want to hear pirates. Right? Ellie Piercy, she came with me one Monday afternoon to the Blacksall ship. That's near Snape, for their round-the-room busking afternoon. And one of the locals, Daphne, sat with Ellie and they went through her lines together so she could actually hear an old Suffolk lady speaking her lines, not just me. And then Bronwyn James came back from Yorkshire for a second workshop. They all knew they mustn't sound like West Country Pirates.
Yeah.
I'd set a high standard and they all responded to that.
That's so good.
Continued with Ray Fiennes with his dialect training, and I also took him to the Blacksall ship on a busking afternoon, Monday. And he joined in. We talked to a number of the locals and he sang a couple of songs. He can hold a good tune, you know. Oh, yes, he can. And he enjoyed it, thoroughly enjoyed himself. Then the filming started in mid-September. Now, my contract was now coming to an end. I'd trained Rafe all that time up to filming, and I'd trained all the other actors. So I was going to be on set for something like the first week and see everything was going right and then go home. But every day they kept on tweaking the scripts. So we had to re-suffocate them, and then you had to relearn the script. Right, so we spent all that time learning that, and now they were tweaking it. So for consistency, Rafe then went to the producer and said, look, because this script is being tweaked all the time, I need Charlie Haylock on board all the time. Because they said, yes, we agree. And so I then carried on right the way through filming until it finished.
Amazing.
I know. And so I had to duck and dive a bit. Now, the initial filming was done in Suffolk, but we couldn't film at Sutton Hoo because, one, it was National Trust. The mounds had already been dug into, so we couldn't dig into them anymore. And also, there was nothing there really. The mounds aren't that big anymore because of the tank training that after the war, or before the war. So we went into Surrey And we did a lot of filming in Surrey. There was a big field there where they had made these mounds, and so they recreated Sutton Hoo and everything else. So there's quite a bit of travelling down to Surrey as well.
Yeah.
So we carried on. Then, after every take, I had to make notes and then report to the script supervisor. Now, they'd make her notes, so it could be 15, 20 takes, sometimes even more. So you're making take after take after take after take. So when it came to editing at the end, if the director turned around and said, right, I want that take there, the script supervisor, oh no, they didn't do the accent very well there. They did it very well there, and so they could pick a scene where they got the accent right.
Oh, wow.
But, oh yeah. But then, right, as soon as I walked up to the script supervisor and said that accent was absolutely superb on that take, the director had already whipped out, going, oh, that was absolutely beautiful, that was absolutely marvellous. He was an Australian, by the way. It was marvellous, that was absolutely great, best one yet. And we very soon twigged that when they got the accent right, the director was saying it was the best acted.
Amazing.
Because they got the rhythm of Suffolk right, they got the way it was pronounced right, and it's, once again, it's the storytelling. And so, yeah. But Rafe, as he came out of every set, the first person he'd look for was me. Right, and I was sat in strategic positions, and he knew where I was. So the first person who'd come out was me. Now, rather than running up and towards one another, we quickly worked out a bit of a sign language. So a thumbs up was obvious. I'd do a beckoning towards me. So we'd then meet up, go through it, tell him where he went wrong, get it right again. And then there was the puckering of the lips. So if he came out to get because West Country, they talk down the bottom of the throat. So you talk down here. To talk, you got to talk down here, down the bottom of the throat. Whereas Suffolk talk at the front of the mouth, right at the front of the mouth.
Yeah.
And so we say farm rather than farm, and barn rather than barn. Right. So we got to now to say words like here and dear and Rowand and Mr. Brown. You actually push your lips out, like blowing a kiss to one another. So if he got those sounds wrong, when he came out of off the set, I would look at him and I'd just pucker my lips. And, well, what he did, he puckered his lips back. It looked as if we were blowing kisses to one another. On one occasion, when he came out, I held up a big notice, 9.7. And Kerry Mulligan, who was playing Mrs. Pretty, they both saw it and they both laughed. The next take, I'm holding up 9.9. And Kerry Mulligan, as Mrs. Pretty, turned around to Basil Brown and said, "You're improving, Brown." Which was, yes, that's rather good. So this went on, and I'd be on the set fairly early in the morning, sometimes at 6 o'clock in the morning, to make sure I was available for Rafe so we could spend time together before he went on the film set. Then in between takes, he and I would get together, go over the lines. He was seeking perfection, he really was. Now, during filming, well, when I first met Rafe, he was an actor who was going to play Basil Brown. By the time we were filming, he was Basil Brown. And as a result, I never called him Rafe anymore, I called him Basil. On set, off set, so I could help him stay in character. That was my little way of helping him. Oh, right. What he did to become Basil Brown, he went to the British Museum and he saw the treasure there. He also held and read Basil Brown's notebooks so he could get into his mindset. He then, on the next occasion we met at the Key Theatre, Sudbury, he cycled from Colchester to Gautrain, then cycled from Colchester to Sudbury in his Basil Brown gear, riding not a racing bike but the old-fashioned postman's bike like Basil Brown had. He then, we had an 8-hour session, right? He then stayed at the Mill Hotel, and then he cycled from Sudbury to Woodbridge, and then cycled from Sutton Hoo to Rickinghall and back, like Basil Brown had done.
Oh my gosh.
He was going to behave like Basil Brown. He went to Rickinghall so he could meet people who knew Basil Brown, so he could find out about the character. He went to Sutton Hoo several times to look at footages and archives so he could dress and become Basil Brown. He went on an archaeological dig, right, so he knew what it was like to be in an archaeological. So when he was being filmed, he wasn't being ham-fisted. He was doing it properly and correctly.
Yeah.
So he did all that, right, which was fantastic.
Yeah.
So you can see he had become the character, and that's why I called him Basil.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Monica Dolan, as Mrs. Brown, she cracked the Suffolk dialect as well. And you'll notice during the film that when they speak to one another, they speak in a broader dialect than when they speak to the toffs.
Mm.
In those days, when you spoke to the toffs, like Lord of the Manor, you then put on a bit of a voice that's not so broad. Well, they did that as well in the film. And Basil Brown, or Ray Fiennes and I, we practiced that. So when he was talking to Mrs. Pretty, it weren't so broad, but when he was talking to May Brown, it was the normal Suffolk dialect.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they were told, when the script finishes, carry on ad-libbing, because the director didn't want to say cut immediately afterwards. He wanted to run a while, and so you had continuity rather than all of a sudden cuts. And some of the ad-libbing, right, was so good that it's in the film. So there's a lot of unscripted ad-libbing in the film. But there was one that didn't get through, and that was when May Brown turned up one night with the shirts, and Basil was surprised, and the script finishes, and he said, in a very suggestive way, "Sure you won't stay the night, May?" To which she replied, "We ain't got time for that, you wait till you get home." I know, because they were in the part, they could do that. That's how good they'd become. And it was, and Monica Dolan also said, because she was being interviewed on BBC Radio Suffolk, and they were complimenting her on the dialect and getting it right, and she said something like, it would be disrespectful to Suffolk people if we didn't.
Mm.
And one time I went up to Monica, there was one word she couldn't get right. There was one word she couldn't get right. And I kept on going up, and I said, "I'm sorry to be a bit of a perfectionist." Well, she turned around and she said, "What's wrong with perfection?" And that little comment, that gave me the confidence to keep on going in there and say, that weren't right.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very, very helpful. Ray Fiennes gave me a lovely, lovely quote. I approached Charlie Haylock as I had watched some YouTube recordings of his talks on the history of spoken English. His ear for dialect is extraordinary. I hoped he'd be able to guide me to the right accent for Basil Brown, the famous Suffolk-born archaeologist who I was playing. Charlie is a perfectionist and would correct me on anything that felt inaccurate. The challenge being especially to avoid sounding West Country. His pleasure when we, the Suffolk characters, got it right was tangible. I loved that it was a matter of pride for Charlie that he wanted us to speak the Suffolk dialect accurately. Charlie's pleasure in the work made it one of the most fulfilling experiences. Can't get better than that, can you?
No, that's amazing.
And then Susanna Lenton, she was the script supervisor. Now, I'd worked with actors before on stage, but never on a film set.
Mm-hmm.
Completely new to me. The best, and this is Susanna Lenton, the script supervisor, the best dialect coach is one who, through working with the technique and understanding of the roots of a dialect, allows an actor to find and play the inner truth of his character. The dialect and the dialogue become as one with the natural physicality and thought process and just the simple being of the character. Charlie absolutely achieved this with Rafe. Having never worked on a film set, Charlie's approach was fresh and insightful. The result of a mind-boggling knowledge of Suffolk history, detailed note-taking on every take of every shot that Rafe was speaking in was impressive. Charlie's gentle manner and dedicated approach to working with the other actors was, I know, much appreciated by them. For myself, it was always fascinating to learn the stories about how the Suffolk dialect originated and evolved, an endearing and hard-working presence on set, and offset the humorous and expansive personality in the pub. There you go.
Wow. I'm asking everyone this, so this is just a sort of side question,
Right.
really. The Sutton Hoo treasures, do you believe they should have gone to the British Museum or to the Ipswich Museum, or should they now go back to Sutton Hoo?
As Mrs. Pretty said, more people will see it at the British Museum.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with Mrs. Pretty.
Mm-hmm.